Hey Sean, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Um,
Happy to be here.
is anybody? Thank you for coming. I think this is going to be a fantastic conversation.
Yeah.
Is anybody else from the team thinking of coming on to speak?
Well, most of them are in Singapore time zone, so
Yeah,
I'm
that's
kind
rough.
of the only person who's awake at the moment.
Yeah, it's rough. Um, if I might provide a suggestion, if you could connect from the Happy Ever After
Ah,
account and maybe seed your like have your personal account also part of the audience, maybe through a computer, that way people will be able to follow you guys directly.
all right, perfect. Let me do that.
Cool. Sounds good.
So should I speak from my personal account or my the happily ever after one?
My suggestion would be from the Happy Ever After account, but it's up to you. It's whatever you're comfortable with.
Okay, perfect. I'll do that then.
Great.
Hello?
There we
Can you hear
go.
me?
All right. Yes, I
All
can
right,
hear you.
perfect.
Great, great. So usually, like I said, I kind of start the space early just to let you settle in or guests settle in and kind of sound check. Your sound sounds great. And then I usually kick it off, anywhere between 12 and 12:05, depending on how many people have filled in.
Yep,
So usually wait till 12:05 to allow most people to trickle in.
perfect.
But yeah, it should be good. If I may ask, like, where are you located in the world?
Oh, now I'm in London. I'm in London.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
And I presume you're in Eastern somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm in Canada,
Cool.
on the eastern side of Canada. Yeah.
Cool, cool.
This is good. This is gonna be great, man. This is gonna be
I'm
great.
excited, looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. I've been going through your guys' documentation and what is really, really impressive. A very thoughtful um, project. Um,
Yeah,
I think it's something that is very much needed for the space.
yeah, it's evolving quickly. I think we're at the stage where it's more about like finding because healthcare is such a complicated space. So
Yeah.
we're still like sort of looking for the right people in the core community. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, hopefully we'll be able to drum up some individuals who share your passion and share your philosophy and who will be willing to come and join.
yeah. I think you guys are doing incredible work as well at DeSci. I actually just checked out your website before joining. Seems like there are a few new features from when I was onboarded.
Yeah, there definitely has been, and thank you for that. I very much appreciate those kind
Yeah,
words. We're definitely trying our best in the social aspect. But yeah, we have a whole slew of upgrades and announcements to make in the coming new year. We're just wrapping up some back end stuff over the holidays, and so we have some big updates coming. So it'll be good. It'll be exciting. It's an exciting time.
yeah.
2023 is going to be the year of
Oh,
DeSci for
for
sure.
sure, for sure. And Merry Christmas, by the way. It's soon.
Merry Christmas to you too. Thank you very much for that. Merry Christmas and a happy holidays. See more people trickling in. Hey Ed, Rod, Rodrigo. It's always good to have you guys here. We'll just give it a couple more minutes just to let people kind of settle in, and then we'll start off with our usual kickoff, and we'll get right into getting to know Happily Ever After better. Shan, I see Consigliere is here, and it says core of HEA. Would they like to come up? Or
Yeah, he is here. He's gone now. He's here for a
yeah, I saw he
brief
popped in and
moment.
popped out.
It is quite late for him. Maybe I don't know when, if he comes back up, you can ask him if he wants to join it.
Yeah, I'll send them an invite to come and speak if they have the opportunity or if they have the desire to do so.
Yeah.
It really is. I think the most difficult timing in the time zone is exactly that, the East Asia or the Asia time zones, and relative to like my time zone, the USA time zone is like ungodly at some time.
Yeah, it's 1
Um,
a.m. in Singapore. I'm surprised he's
exactly,
even
right?
awake right now.
Yeah, the dedication to the cause, man. Dedication to the cause will bring people. So always
Yeah.
appreciated. It's funny. I've done the kind of meetings that I have with individuals who are like projects in Australia. Those are always fun. Trying to coordinate. All right, can I wake up at 3 a.m. that morning? Am I going to be functional enough?
Yeah, yeah. 'Cause- yeah. 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 Yeah.
So
Yeah, most of our team is sort of in Europe onwards, so like London, Rome, and then Asia. And then the
Okay.
time zone's a bit
Okay.
better, because there's not
Yeah.
many
Yeah.
people on the American continent. But
Yes.
yeah, definitely a challenge. I think for many DAO communities is the challenge of like how do you cater to the entire, if it's completely decentralized across the world, like then there is no real concept of time zone that works.
Exactly. I think the best approach, in my opinion, is to make sure that your team is as diverse as possible, from a time zone perspective, also from a personal and experience perspective. But like internal to ourselves, a lot of us are located within the North American continent as well as South America, but we have a few that are like in Europe. And so when it comes to meetings in further time zones, we just relay it to them like, hey, you got to take this meeting because it's like way outside of the hours for the rest of
Yeah,
them.
yeah, that's
But
probably a
yeah,
good shout. Yeah.
for sure. So I guess we'll get started. More people will join as they come through, and if anybody from the team it does pop in and they do want to come out, just point them out to me and I'll bring them
Yep.
up. Cool. So, hello everybody. My name is Jelani, if you guys don't realize at this point. Welcome to the 17th episode of the DeSci Rising series, put on by DeSci World, where our goal here is always to provide an opportunity for many of the wonderful projects on our growing DeSci World dashboard to just formally introduce themselves, update their progress, highlight their achievements, and just generally engage with both the DeSci World and wider DeSci community. Now, the idea behind all this is that at DeSci World, we very much believe that more than the tech, more than the funding, it is the community using these tools that will usher in many of the changes that we are looking for DeSci to bring to the various legacy STEM industries. And of particular importance here, the project that we're going to be talking about or delving into today really embodies this philosophy of community over the tech that backs it. So, in today's episode, I have the very great pleasure of speaking with Shan, the founder of Happily Ever After, which is a community run preventative care network of health and well being spaces geared towards helping individuals nurture their mind, body, and soul. And as a whole, they are very specifically focused on the concept of universal preventative health care. And so, without further ado, welcome, Shan, and thank you very much for your time today and helping us learn more about yourself as well as the work being done at Happily Ever After.
Thank you so much, Jelani. It's a it's a pleasure to be here and join you guys and talk to everyone here as well, regarding our mission, but also about broader the broader scene in DeSci.
Yeah, for sure. I think, not only because of, I mean, your mission statement is extremely important, but especially because of the times that we're in, the holiday season, the state of the world, the concept of happily ever after seems to be waning. And it's nice to see projects that kind of use this moniker to kind of infuse this ideology into hopefully the communities that they're building. And then it kind of branches and relays out after that. So, how I kind of like to start this off as usual is basically I'd love to get a kind of a background origin story of yourself and how you kind of came into Web3 and the development of Happily Ever After.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. So my name is Sean, and thank you for your intro. I'm Soldier in Twitter, if you can see my icon there. I'm I'm actually from Singapore. So when I was the real story behind how Happily After came about was actually when I was 16, which wasn't that long ago. That was in 2016. I had an eating disorder, and for me, like no one really came around, and eating disorders are quite hard to identify, I think, for a lot of people. But it really sort of wrecked my mental, physical, emotional well being over the span of a couple of months. And this was when I was 16 and I sort of dealt with the problem. I eventually, I ended up fainting, but then, the traditional healthcare system kicked in and people were made aware of, and I slowly got better, but it was a long 4-year journey, I think, for me to learn how to be comfortable with how I looked, how I felt, and the thoughts in my head. And that was really a process that I did more or less in solo player mode and as an individual, not so much with much community support or anything of that sort. And so I've always had this sort of idea that the way that healthcare is done in the world or in Singapore at least, has been very reactive, and sort of it's been like you something happens to you and then it kicks in, as opposed to what I think would be a better way to do it. It'd be a more proactive or a preventive approach to healthcare and well-being. Um, so that's sort of the backstory behind how I got interested in the idea of preventive care and health as a sector. At the same time, I was involved in a impact collective called Audacity, and Audacity is it's a community in Singapore that focuses mainly on moonshot ideas regarding climate, regarding food security, regarding water security, and they fund different projects in that space. And I was involved with them because they picked me out at high school to be basically an intern, hang around and help out with a couple of the projects. And when I was there, I saw people working on some incredible problems. And a really good example would be a person working on steam power for remote villages in Indonesia based on using the sun to heat up water. So this is steam power that is really accessible, doesn't require complex maintenance. And the kind of ambition that these teams had in that community really inspired me to say, well, I mean, I know I care about this problem. Why don't I try to do something about it? And that is sort of what kicked off the ideation behind Happily Ever After. But we didn't really start off saying we were going to be a DAO or saying we're going to get into Web3. We started off very much taking a step back and thinking about healthcare, health systems, and looking at the existing literature out there, stuff like the quadruple aim, which is literature on how sort of healthcare can be done differently, and also started building out like a team of people who had similar stories to me, and having regular meetings with them talking about this problem. And this was back at I would say, the end of last year. That's when these things started. And from there, we made a few prototypes. We had a few collaborations with a sleep institute in NUS, which is the university in Singapore, to work out, as a start, like maybe we could solve the problem of sleep. And we were working on a few intervention programs with them. And that was actually when I started getting to hear more and more about Web3. I was always a technology person, but the idea of crypto never super appealed to me, at least when I was first hearing about it. It just seemed like a bunch of scams. But when they changed the word to Web3 and started talking about a lot more stuff that related to green pilling, stuff that related to incentive mechanisms and changing systems as opposed to just starting a startup, I think that's what really got me thinking about whether there was any opportunity to apply ideas in Web3 and the technology itself to the problems that I was thinking about in healthcare. So I talked about this to the team, and we got into DAOs and we did a bit of research, and that's kind of where HEA was born. Is this idea that the technology and the ideologies of Web3 can really be used to change the way the incentives in the healthcare industry work. That is the broad idea, and that's what gave birth to HEA, and that's sort of what fueled my journey to get there.
It's a beautiful story, right? And I think it embodies, or at least it's very similar to a lot of other projects in the DeSci space, of this purpose-driven initiative, this purpose-driven concept, which then, cobbles together tools and tech stacks, whether it be Web 2, Web 3, or what have you, to kind of bring this and push this forward, right? And this is why I love being in this space, because it's exactly that. It's impact first, and then all the other things kind of come behind. And so I want to definitely delve into the concept of, the DAO infrastructure and kind of how Happily Ever After works as an engine. But I think importantly, what I would really like to know is, considering your history and what you just talked about in terms of having eating disorders and kind of working your way through to being in a better mental space, what do you think are some of the components that people need to be aware of or should be aware of when it comes to their own fight and plight to kind of get to a better state of mind?
That's a really good question, and I think um, I think it's a very personal question as well because the struggles that each of us face in healthcare are very personal, not just personal in the sense of the individual, but personal in the sense of the locality and the community that you're a part of. And often, we talk about health promotion as being really important, and the idea of eating right, sleeping well. The foundation of all of this is that it's very easy to say to sleep 7 hours a day, and it's very easy to say eat healthy food, but it's not really the knowledge of knowing what to do in preventive health or in getting better. It doesn't really translate to actually getting better, and in the process of translating the knowledge of how to get better to actually getting better is actually really dependent on the journey of the individual person and the kind of support that they have. So for me personally, I was kind of blessed with the resolve to be able to think and deal with this problem on my own. But I know many people who maybe do not have the same level of self control or the ability to be self aware. And I think that is an important skill that is that should be taught in schools, honestly. The ability to be self aware and to know what things you're good at and what things you're not good at and what things you should be more aware of, that isn't really taught anywhere. It's just something that you have to learn if you happen to need it. And I think preventive care all comes down to this. Like, it comes down to this idea that you can teach people, and it's almost like a self-redundant system. The main goal of preventive care is to teach people to take care of themselves and to practice self-care. And then you don't have to sort of have an active line of communication with them.
Yeah, it really does. I think it does really boil down to that, and I very much appreciate your point of, self-awareness, autonomy is kind of lost in the world that we live in. It's definitely not something that is specifically taught to individuals from an academic standpoint, and you just gotta hope that either you have it or your immediate vicinity, your communication, your network, your support system kind of can instill this in you. And I think that's not the case. It's not as obvious or it's not as frequent as we like to hope, right? Which is kind of why we need initiatives and collectives like yourselves. But it's very good to know that you have that level of insight in it and have been an individual who has worked their way through, because I think it gives you not necessarily a unique but a better perspective of maybe how to help others, because it's true, right? Everybody's It's almost like the definition of personalized medicine or personalized healthcare, right? It's internal to yourself. You need to figure it out, but people can help you um, if they understand how to do so.
Yeah, and maybe another point to add on here is really coming back to the idea of autonomy. Like, one of the main reasons why HEA was so appealing to me to start and spend so much time on was the fact that it really feels like a lot of us have lost the autonomy over our well-being. Like, we've sort of given up the care that we have over our own well-being to the healthcare ecosystem or the healthcare system. Like, we believe that doctors will take care of us, yes, and I think it's important to have that trust, but it's not so important to lose your autonomy and your responsibility for your own well-being. But I think that's the situation where a lot of people feel like it's not really up to them and they're not qualified enough to actually take care of themselves in a way. And that is something that I want to change. I want to, or HEA wants to, show people that they can take autonomy over their own well-being, and it's possible to understand your own body and be self-aware with the things that you're doing, not just your body, but also your mind and your relational health. Yeah.
No, I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree, right? It's this funny scenario where people will do preventative maintenance on their objects, their cars, their other robotics, their tools, their stuff, their materials, but they won't do preventative care on their bodies, right?
Yeah.
Despite the fact that many do believe that, the body is a machine in its multiple forms, but they kind of treat it as, okay, it breaks and then we take care of it.
Yeah.
Um, but they don't do that for anything or for a vast majority of other things. So it's like this weird disconnect of understanding that no, you're the only thing that, like, without your body, you have nothing else. It is the carrier, it is the vessel that transports you and that, allows you to operate within this plane. And so you need to take care of it. And that means preventative maintenance. Do your oil changes. Make sure you're putting in the right, fuel into it and a lot of the like. And not just from a physical perspective, but mental. Mental is so overlooked in terms of what we put into our mental and how it impacts us on the way out. And once it's in there, it's very hard to get that dislodged or changed, despite the level of neuroplasticity that exists. So no, I very much ascribe to this philosophy of being prophylactic is more than being reactive to what kind of comes afterwards. Because at some point, sometimes the damage is done, and you may be able to repair some of it, but you'll never become back to 100%.
Yeah, and I think it it is at the same time I'm also a bit um it's not completely about autonomy in the sense where like 89% of there's also social determinants of health is not just your behavior, but it's also stuff like your environment. It's whether you live in a place where you can get access to affordable healthy food. It's the problem of preventive healthcare is actually like really interdisciplinary. It's across many different spectrum of problems. Like it depends on your social economic class. It depends on where you live. Your zip code is a better predictor of your well-being than your genetic code. So it's quite important that when we think about preventive healthcare, we're thinking about it in terms of the community and the local context that it exists in. The community that is fairly well off has very different preventive health goals than a community who is not very well off because of the types of monetary resources they have access to and the types of time they have access to put into their own body. So even if we say like autonomy is really important, but the context around that is also important, whether they can actually act on their given autonomy. And that's part of why we really lean towards the DAO side of HEA. It's this idea that you cannot build a one size fits all solution. Rather, it's really about empowering local community centered healthcare where the context that the preventive healthcare is given in is taken into consideration and it's sort of integrated into the kind of care that you're providing.
Right. It's a very holistic and comprehensive approach.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that's I think that's the best. I mean, it's the only way to really achieve this in a truly impactful way. And so, if I may ask, what does the I guess you mentioned the DAO portion, but what does the DAO infrastructure of HEA look like? Like, if I'm going to come into the Discord or I'm going to come into the platform, what do I expect to see, and what is the learning curve that I have to basically achieve in terms of understanding how to contribute to HEA?
So there are a few main ways in which we think about contribution in HEA, but the most important thing is that in HEA we have just people who are in the community coming to events, sort of participants. We call those members of the network, and then we have healers. Healers starting with HEA it's named for active contributors within HEA who are working on various different parts of the vision and the network that we're trying to build. So I guess as a person coming into HEA, if you are interested in actually experiencing a space or experiencing some of the technology that HEA is building, then you would just be considered a member. But if you're interested in actually contributing to HEA, the first step is to join us and become a healer. The reason why, so I would consider it a bit more inflexible in terms of contribution than a traditional DAO where you can typically come in, take a small task, contribute, and then leave. And the reason for that is that we want to build a very strong healer community or contributor community that is committed to the vision long term, because we think that this is a hard problem and we need people who we can count on to stick around. So the barrier to entry to becoming a healer is actually slightly higher than becoming a contributor in any random DAO. And we also make sure that we get a nice diverse set of people becoming healers. And when I say diverse, it means stuff like clinicians, sleep researchers, public health policymakers. So it's a really diverse mix of people, and we have this big hairy problem statement we're trying to solve, and we need that sort of interdisciplinary working groups to think about and come up with solutions to the problem. So it is quite a high barrier of entry. But once you become a healer, there are a few things that our healers are working on right now. The first is what we call projects. Projects are interdisciplinary teams of healers. It could be, they run more or less like autonomous working groups in the same way like a pod would run in a typical DAO. And these projects are working on different stuff from building our platform to coming up with intervention programs for sleep, designing accountability circles so that we could go into other DAOs and set up wellness communities in other DAOs so we can provide wellness at the point of community. And some other really interesting projects that various people are working on. And then the other aspect is this idea of spaces. So to give a broad overview of what HA is trying to achieve, we're trying to build a network of health and well-being spaces. This means you could think about them as a network of wellness clinics. They provide some sort of preventive health service. This could be, quite interesting stuff from somatic dance, all the way to cold exposure, to meditation, to sleep intervention program. And these spaces are run as autonomous nodes in the network where they offer and control the service that they're providing. So these are run by our healers, and the healers basically some of them run their own spaces. And the technology that we build, the platform that we build, really serves to enable these spaces, to connect them together, to share software, to replicate spaces across different communities. And so there are two main things: spaces and projects. As a healer joins, they can either work on projects or they can set up their own space. And our goal is eventually to have a network of these spaces who offer preventive care services.
So there are a few things there that you touched upon that I'd definitely like to go in deeper. But to your last point, these spaces, so if I'm a healer, are these virtual spaces, or do they also have in real life counterparts to them for their particular specific regional location?
We call them cyber physical, in a sense where some spaces are fine being virtually, and in fact, being virtual is desirable if you're trying to get a larger reach or help more people at the same time. So an example there would be our meditation space, which happens every Saturday, and that is sort of it opens up so that people around the world can come in. But then some spaces are really much better physically. For example, you can't do a cold exposure space or community virtually. So the cold exposure space
Right.
actually happens in a park in London, and so it's really up to the healer themselves. Like we talk, so when a healer gets onboarded, it's not just about what happily ever after once, but it's also about where the healer's personal purpose lies and how that aligns with the purpose of the collective. So a healer could come up and they could say they have this really interesting program that they want to design and they want to run as a space, and basically we're there to support them and integrate that into the network. This could be physical and this could be virtual, but it's a real mix between the two right now.
That makes sense. I imagine, like you said, it's hard, and it's hard to do this in a physical sense, much easier to do this digitally. But I can envision that as things pick up and HA continues to mature and your network becomes bigger, we'll probably see these kind of geographic or locations, or like a HA wellness center popping up in various different locations, which would be actually probably very exciting um, to see.
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
No, I think that is kind of the big vision. It takes a lot of effort to get to that point, but the big vision is really that you could have these preventive care centers embedded in your local community, where instead of having a problem and then you go to the doctor, you go to the preventive wellness center regularly, like once a month or twice a year even. And this is not, it might sound that far-fetched that something like this could be built, but this is actually not even a new concept. They've been doing it. So in Cuba, they have this program called the Family Doctor and Nurse Program, and they have a really, really high physician to population ratio. So they have a lot of doctors for for that specific size of population. And in Cuba, they follow a model of preventive primary care, where their doctors might be less sophisticated and use less technology than more developed countries like the US and Singapore. But instead, they have a very high frequency touch point of care. So your doctors are showing up to stuff like your wedding. They're kind of embedded in the communities that they serve. And in that sense, Cuba actually has a higher life expectancy than the US, and although it spends about 5 times less GDP per capita, when healthcare expenditure GDP compared to GDP per capita. So that's sort of Cuba, and Singapore is trying something similar as well with the Healthier SG program that they just rolled out at the couple of months ago, which has every Singaporean citizen meeting with a family doctor about twice a year, just to have a check-in. So that's sort of the goal, and I think the DAO approach and the ability of empowering more autonomous, locally contextualized healthcare to take over is going to be a good strategy to enable that kind of embedded community healthcare.
Yeah, and I mean, you would think that it would make sense, but it kind of begs the question. I mean, Cuba's been doing this for years. You just mentioned Singapore, and in reading through your documentation, it makes reference to the Buurtzorg model, which I believe is a Swedish or Northern European model of healthcare.
Yeah, so the Buurtzorg model is interesting. They're actually not really they're not a healthcare organization, but rather they're a organization that provides home care to the elderly. So they're basically the reason why we reference Buurtzorg, because Buurtzorg is a different organizational structure than any other hierarchical organization, which are most healthcare organizations are fairly hierarchical in their structure. But Buurtzorg actually operates on a self-management philosophy. So Buurtzorg, founded in 2006, looks a lot like a DAO before DAOs became a thing. And they have autonomous groups of nurses that serve each community that they're embedded in. And the nurses essentially, they don't co-own the entire organization, but they essentially co-decide organizational processes across the entirety of Buurtzorg. And they actually have a really high workplace satisfaction index rating in the Netherlands. So I think Buurtzorg is a great inspiration for not just HEA, but for many DAOs to draw upon to learn how self-management organizations could function. And I recall there's a really good book about this called Reinventing Organizations, which I think is a must-read for any DAO founder or DAO operator. And it really goes into details about how do you build processes that enable self-management in organizations. How do you create more hierarchical organizational structure rather than a hierarchical organizational structure? But yeah, that's why we mentioned Buurtzorg.
Okay, I'm definitely interested in reading that book. I think one of the major reasons why we see DAOs sometimes either fall apart or be less efficient as they could be is because most individuals are coming in from this top-down hierarchical framework, right? That's what we've been taught for so long. That's how we're used to operating. And it takes considerable amount of time and foresight and like introspection to be able to shift that and truly understand, or as best as one can, that DAOs have to operate in a complete and almost a flipped, a 180 flipped version of hierarchy. Um, and yeah, I think any type of literature, I'm going to put that. If you can you say the name of that book again? I'm just going to write it
It's
down
called
here.
Reinventing Organizations.
Reinventing Organizations.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I'll definitely take a look at that.
There is
I'd love to kind of get your.
there's even a
Sorry, go ahead.
wiki, so you can go to reinventingorganisationswiki.com, and I think that's even better than reading the book because it's much faster to get through the wiki than to read the book.
For sure. But let me ask you, and this is, personal opinion, obviously, but why do you think that this type of preventative healthcare mechanism, given that it's shown to be beneficial in pocket cases like Cuba, like the Netherlands to a certain extent, and Singapore now is running it up, why is it taking so long, or what is it that's hindering its adoption more widespread?
Oh, this is a great question. In fact, we had a conversation about this with one of our new healers who has a background of doing public health at Imperial College London, and he was essentially bringing up this very interesting problem to do with with preventive healthcare that ends up being quite counterintuitive to think about, and I'll illustrate it really quickly. But if you take a person who let's say would be in a traditional reactive healthcare system, and let's say they get sick when they're 60, and then they have to go through either diabetes treatment or cancer treatment, and then they end up passing away maybe 10 years later with a reduced quality of life. Then your cost incurred for that healthcare process is the cost that you pay to go through that diabetes and cancer treatment. But the problem is, you would think that when you have reactive healthcare, when you have preventive healthcare, you would reduce that cost because people generally end up being healthier. But the observed effect could instead be that when you have preventive healthcare, the person just ends up getting diabetes or cancer or age-related ailments 10 years down the road, and then they end up spending the same amount of money going through the care process. And so overall, you just end up adding costs to the healthcare ecosystem as opposed to removing costs from the healthcare ecosystem. So this was a discussion in the context of public health policy and why sometimes politicians are a bit slower at adopting preventive healthcare practice is because of this dynamic that, first of all, there's short-term costs to preventive healthcare, and politicians generally don't make short-term cost decisions over long-term sort of benefits. But beyond that, there's also this sort of paradoxical problem with preventive wellness, where you have the overall cost still doesn't go down. But to counter that point, there was a really interesting article called "How Doctors Die," and "How Doctors Die" is an article about what is the typical process that doctors take when they are close to being when they are close to dying, and when they have been diagnosed with some sort of terminal illness. And that is a very interesting article because it shows that doctors actually don't take much treatment when they've been diagnosed with terminal illnesses, as opposed to most people who tend to take a lot of treatment before terminal illnesses. And the reason for that is that when we think about living, or when we think about living life, we think about lifespan. That's the main metric that we use. Is your average lifespan 80? Is your average lifespan 90? And when we think about longevity, or a good healthcare system, we think about boosting that lifespan. So from 80 to 90, from 90 to 100. And that's generally sort of a goal in healthcare. But what we often don't think about is the idea of health span, which is the idea of what is the point at which you sort of start to lose autonomy, when you start to live a subpar life, when you're taking lots of medication, when you're wheelchair bound, when you are diagnosed with arthritis and you're living in pain. And often there's not enough discussion about pushing health span as opposed to pushing lifespan. And the reason why doctors tend to avoid taking too much medical aid towards when diagnosed with a terminal illness is that they don't actually have much intention to live during a period of time where it's mostly just pain. So they tend to take the shorter route out. And that's a broader counter to how we should focus more on pushing health span up rather than focus more on reactive healthcare and pushing lifespan up. Yeah.
That is a beautiful point, especially as it relates to the DeSci space, because a major niche in that is longevity and longevity research and the biomedical approaches to do this. But I don't hear enough conversations in terms of quality of life. And I think what Happily Ever After and the concept of preventative healthcare is squarely rooted in the context of quality of life over the quantity of additional years that may be added on. I think that makes a very important difference, which is highlighted by how doctors die, um, as a point. Now, I'd like to kind of take a step back to what we talked about in terms of why you believe why preventive healthcare is not necessarily as adopted or is not championed in the same way from like government bodies and institutional entities. And you highlight the fact that this narrowed perspective of the financial perspective of it, wherein people are going to be a good amount of people are going to be getting these age-related degenerative diseases, and so you'll just be doubling the amount of cost that comes for this by also tacking on the preventative healthcare. But I wonder if that's too much. I mean, and not to yourself, but just to kind of expand on this point, I wonder if that's also too narrow of a perspective for these politicians, in that if you provide a healthier, a greater quality of life of individuals, even though we haven't defeated aging yet, but you may extend the ability of individuals to be autonomous and therefore work and contribute to GDP and create the society that is a little bit better off, which you can then, from their perspective, extract more from. I feel like that, it's a very limited perspective just to say, oh, we're going to add on, it's going to be additional cost. And so, we're not going to do that because it's too much for us. I think there's many more benefits, even from the economic perspective, than there are downsides. Would you agree? Would you disagree?
I would definitely agree. The point I was illustrating was kind of a narrow scenario that we were playing out, and it was really interesting conversation. But more broadly speaking, I definitely think there is a space for preventive care, and I think one of the main drivers that possibly is going to push and accelerate this process of transitioning to a more preventive care is the general aging epidemic that we're dealing with. And one of the primary drivers behind Singapore adopting more preventive care is because we have a very quickly aging population. And at that point where, let's say about 40% of your population is above the age of 60 and 50% is above the age of 60. When you start pushing that, it becomes really important to make sure that they do not actually suffer from causes of disease that could have been easily prevented by lifestyle interventions or behavior change. And so as more and more countries observe the aging phenomenon, I think the focus on preventive care would naturally happen. As for why isn't happening faster, I actually don't have a really good answer for this. Probably have to review a bunch of literature on that, but it is a very complex problem when thinking about healthcare. I mean, you can't really say it's just a financial problem, nor is it just a political or a social problem. You also have to think about the fact that fundamentally preventive healthcare comes down to the idea of behavior change, and people don't like to be told when their behavior needs to be changed. So that in itself is a fundamental paradox.
So I laugh about that because I'm the primary caregiver to my grandparents,
Yeah.
and I've spent many years arguing with my very stubborn but loving grandfather that he needs to change his ways to kind of help alleviate any conditioning that he has, and I've spent many years being told to mind your own business, and I will do what I want to do, and I'm old already, so it is what it is. So yes, it is very difficult to tell an individual or to kind of usher in or get them to realize that sometimes it's you have to change your behavior, and people don't like being told that. So that's very funny anecdotal note. And yeah, to your point, I mean, the question definitely wasn't for you to answer. I think nobody really has the answer to this per se. Everything is an experiment. The world is a stage, and we're all trying things well, most of us are trying things to kind of make it a better place. And I definitely think that your considerations and the work that is being done at Happy Ever After is one more step in that direction to make, preventative healthcare more of a focus in our medical system.
Yeah.
And so to kind of expand on that, in your literature, in your documentation, you make reference to engineering culture and tech to support your goals. And so, what is your vision for the kind of human tech interface, and how does that relate to the mission at HEA?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it comes back to the problem that I highlighted about behavior change. One of the things that we learned very early on, thinking about preventive healthcare, and sort of the first thing we did, maybe kind of funny now, but was to create an app for the sleep intervention program. Our big idea then, when we were working on that, was that we were going to create a super app that could do everything in healthcare. It's a very ambitious goal, and very hard to execute on. But we also realized that there are 58,000 health apps on the App Store. And the
Yeah,
the the thing here is that when you think about health, especially preventive health, technology only gets you so far. If you have the most world-class biomonitoring system that can predict exactly what you need to do given a set of metrics, including like your biomarkers and stuff. And there is that technology now. We have really good genetic tests. We have stuff like the Harbaugh clock that can show you epigenetic age. But then the question is like, given all that data, it doesn't actually matter if the person doesn't make the step to actually
exactly.
do it.
Yes.
So when we shifted into being more of a DAO, one of the things that we were thinking about was that, well, it's not enough to just think about this from a technological perspective. We have to think about how do we engineer culture, and how do we bring a culture where people feel safe, supported, and exploratory about their own well-being. And oftentimes, it is the very fact that healthcare is so prescriptive. When you walk into a clinic, you're told to do something. Um, that's what sort of stops you from actually doing it, as opposed to if you arrive to that conclusion yourself, through something more that looks more like a co-creation or a co-design process of your own healthcare experience. And one of the big mission or problem statements that we had was, how do we make healthcare experiences more inclusive, more joyful, and something that people actually enjoy going to, as opposed to something that people really don't want to go to because they don't want to listen to all the ways that they had not eaten right or not slept right in the past month. Um, so
Right. It's less of a punishment and more of a collaborative effort.
yeah, more of a sit down and a conversation about how they're doing and how they could be doing stuff better, as opposed to more of like, you're not doing this right. And that requires that we design a framework or a culture that our healers are following, in terms of how the value system of HCA works and what we think a co-created health experience should be like. And so that is sort of part of the cultural innovation, is designing like the actual framework for health, preventive health to be provided. And that's a very big focus alongside the technological side of things, which really serves to support the culture. And when I say like, when you say stuff like culture, technology, interaction, it comes back to building technology that puts humans and human centric design principles at the center of what we're designing for, as opposed to just saying it's a cool technology. So when we design, we really focus on how do we empower our healers to provide care in a way that doesn't burn them out, but also provides really high quality care to the people and the members using the spaces. And that is how they interact. The cultural values inform the ways in which we use technology. We try to use it in a way that empowers people as opposed to replaces people, or make an app that no one uses because it's just it doesn't really, it lacks the human element of care, which is really important. A good example,
No.
I think, just to sort of make everything more tangible and root it into a project that we've already done, was the sleep intervention project, where we tried to think about this problem a little bit. And one of the things that we did was, our sleep intervention program was done in peer support groups of 4 to 5 people who had a healer or a guide attached to them. And it was very much, the guide themselves had access to the in their group, the guide had access to information about how each of them were doing, because each of them were doing a check-in every morning on a Telegram bot. And so this means that the guide kind of could proactively reach out and support people who they knew were kind of falling behind. And that enables the guide to really do things that they couldn't do before, because previously the guide would have to ask every single person how they slept, and it would just be a really maybe like a really time consuming process. But now the guide sort of has an awareness of how everyone is doing and can react on that information. So the technology serves to empower the guide to provide better care.
Yeah. You know, if nothing else, tech's contribution to the reduction of latency between interactions with individuals is definitely going to bring this kind of further. And in the comments, in the comments here, Ruskism highlights the fact that DAOs in healthcare are what he believes to be the missing link for universal healthcare. And I would be one to agree with this because inherently DAOs, at least at their fundamental structure, are people first, right? It is a wrangling of a community of individuals with a shared purpose to kind of tackle this. So it is inherently human centric. And I think that's something that is very important and sometimes does get lost as DAOs become bigger and they start to mature. But I think that's a principal tenet that needs to be maintained and like proactively engaged and nurtured within DAO culture. And you make reference to earlier on, you made reference to developing this initiative to go into individual DAOs and kind of seed these communities of healthcare and preventative health within these individual DAOs. And I think that's what I uh, that's what I hope to be the DAO's equivalent of like um, social benefits, right? DAOs don't really have those in their current iteration, and they don't really have an HR um, framework to kind of help support individuals in their problems. And I would love to see health happily ever after kind of fill in that role and help support that. I think that's a critically underserved part of the Web3 infrastructure. How do we support the participants in a DAO so that they can stay healthy and support their lifestyle?
Yeah, and again, it comes back to the idea of locality and local specific care. And when I say local, a lot of people tend to assume that only mean like physical locality, but we live in a pretty modern world where the idea of identity and community for us is more or less bridged all over the world. We could really consider ourselves part of being a community, and that puts us in a cyber physical locality in the community that we're a part of. And our project with DAO collaborations, at least starting with next year, is really to say one of the first things we can do in the Web3 space, serving people who are also building in the Web3 space, is a natural starting point for something like HEA, and setting up spaces and helping DAOs care more about the well-being of their members is something that we could provide as a public good for the DAOs that are already existing, because that is definitely a missing link, and I definitely agree with what you were saying.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I'm glad that you say that because I will personally be knocking on that door to see how we can integrate this with DeSci World. Um, and then relay that to the rest of the DeSci space because we definitely need this more, community centric perspective. And so, okay, so we talked about the framework of the DAO. We've talked about it from the perspective of the healers that come in and kind of help support the narrative and provide this not mentorship, but aspect for the individual. But from the individual's perspective, what does the user interface look like? So I'm suffering, or I feel like I can benefit from the activities and initiatives at HEA. Can you kind of walk us through how an individual would come in and start to work or to join the collective and reap the benefits of it?
Right. So this is actually a work in progress, but I can tell you what we have right now and what we're looking to build over the next year. So right
Yes,
now,
please.
our goal mainly is more focused on the healer side of things because we want to aggregate enough healers to solve the cold start problem with this sorts of networks. And what we have for people who are interested to come and participate in are our healer setup spaces. And these could be physical spaces if you're based in a place like London, and next year we're starting in Singapore as well, or virtual spaces which the healers are providing. And you can see all of those spaces on our website because they're all in the event section of our website. So the focus for the next 1 to 2 months is really on getting many of these spaces up and helping our healers set up spaces. We have spaces coming up on somatic dance, accountability circles, and sleep to be launched at the start or near the start of next year. So that is where we are with the member experience now. But where we are going with the member experience next year is really about, right now we use Luma as the main event management platform for our spaces. But I think there is a lot of opportunity to build a bespoke interface which lets people essentially be involved in the network through a full end-to-end like engaged experience, which brings it back to their own well-being. So that involves stuff like data, which we're trying to figure out because when we start talking about data, especially in Web3, it gets quite sensitive, especially when it's health data. Like how do we allow healers to use sort of wearable tracking data, but also like journaling data from the network members to cater their services better. So that's a conversation that's going and part of the platform that we're building. So that's one thing. And another thing is how do we design a starting point or an onboarding mechanism for new members? And we had a recent discussion last week where we would have specialized healers who were in charge of essentially designing programs or intervention programs for people as they entered the network. So this is still a work in progress, but it'll probably be integrated into the platform experience that we're building at HEA. But all of this is sort of speculation at this point because we only launched the DAO in the end of September. So we haven't had too much time to start into the building side of things. But hopefully by the mid of next year, we'll have something that I can give you a more concrete answer on.
Oh, we'll be sure to have you guys back and not just have you back, but be apprised. As you know, big shout out to those listening, but DeSci Latin is here as well. And I think, you know, more so than some of the other initiatives in the space, things like preventative healthcare and the framework that you're building out really sits well with these DeSci regional groups in terms of the just the general population that can benefit from this. And so I'd very much like to see that plugged into these frameworks. So we at DeSci World have started this world of DeSci where we want to bring together these different regional groups. And I think happily ever after, we'd love to kind of get you guys involved with that to see how we can spring up this initiative in these different groups and maybe onboard more people using this framework, because I think it's much more applicable than necessarily, okay, let's go, you know, fund a particular research endeavor or, you know, facilitate something doing tech. Being able to just have this consultation capacity, this communication network with individuals who are, you know, interested in helping you from a personal perspective, I think is very, very powerful. And I love to see it in the Web3 space since we're so technically minded. It's nice to take a step back and remember that we're still people. And beyond all this tech, we still need to deal with our day-to-day lives. And sometimes the tech just can't solve that. We need this kind of interpersonal interaction.
Yeah, and I also want to make a point that even though we're still building out our platform, the value that we provide, or at least the way we think about building tech, is very much to do it manually first. So a lot of the things that we do, let's say our accountability circles, and talked about setting it up in DAOs, the way we are approaching the problem is not let's build a Discord bot, but rather it's let's go in, let's run this ourselves, and then let's see what can and shouldn't, what can be automated and what should be automated. And there are some things that shouldn't be automated because there's a human element to it. So we will definitely be launching a lot of manual initiatives with other DAOs regarding stuff like accountability and setting up wellness spaces, which we'll be excited to collaborate with you guys and also anyone in the audience who's interested.
Absolutely. So, I mean, we will be definitely reaching out, but anybody else, I highly encourage you to do so. Um, and so as we, you know, approach the top of the hour, I have two more questions before we open it up to the listeners to ask. But personally to yourself, Shan, what is your definition of success for HEA?
Oh, that is a very interesting question, and I'm gonna answer that but I'm gonna preface that with something first. I think the beautiful thing about running a DAO and being a co-founder at a DAO is that the DAO very much has its own evolutionary purpose that is separate from what you define for it, and that is very different from how you would, you know, run a startup. I come from a background of being more involved with startups and being with DAOs, and something that has fascinated me is the dynamic ability of DAOs and DAO members to collectively sense make and collectively define what success could be for an organization beyond what the founder sort of desires for it. And a lot of times, my role at HEA has not been about explicitly defining success, but rather listening to HEA's community and HEA's members, and then sort of almost uh, following what HEA's general purpose is. But for me personally, to answer your question, I think when HEA has a strong network of health and well-being spaces, where it can provide a variety of preventive wellness services, where it is able to take a person who might not even have previously considered, taking autonomy of their health, but being able to take that person and say you can, and put them through a sort of tried and tested process, where they can emerge at the other side, having the ability and the tools and the community to approach their own health experience and their own well-being journeys. I think we have done a good job, when we've reached that point where we can convince people like your grandfather to take a chance, at a healthier and happier and preventive styled life.
I very much appreciate that. And I think a lot of that starts with, as you say, like the beginnings, it's the beginning stages. How do you prompt individuals? And I think that starts from an education perspective, an early education perspective. And I think if we can start getting this message across more clearly, more widespread, it won't be so foreign for people to think that they can take their health in their own hands, and you don't need to be a specialized individual like a doctor, though they are extremely useful, but you also can contribute to your own lifespan. You can contribute to your own quality of life. You don't necessarily always have to defer to these individuals or wait for them to challenge you on your behaviors. You should always be insightful and internal. And I wish that you could see the huge smile that I had on my mouth when you were talking about, the concept of the Tao and how it is almost like a self-governing biological entity that evolves over time based off of the different input and challenges that the community brings to it. Because that's exactly the same ethos that I have, and I compare it, I parallel it to being a parent. I think different from Web 2, when you're operating in the Web 3 space exclusively and building these DAOs, they're almost like children. They're like your own little entity, right? And you are the parent. As a founder, you're the parent, but you shouldn't, I'm not going to say shouldn't, but your role is to guide it, to maybe be some form of an influencing force, but not necessarily the executor of and the demander, the tyrant that determines where things need to go. They're almost living organisms, right? Um, and they need to be able to grow, and they'll be able to grow, and you can kind of take a step back and see how it kind of shapes itself. And I think that's a beautiful thing. I think that's a beautiful thing and something that is very sustainable in the long term. And this is why I think DAOs are going to be have so much traction because they're flexible. They're anti-fragile by nature. And they grow and they adapt and they change, which is much more difficult to do from a very rigid structure of a traditional company.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the beauties about building, especially systems like healthcare, as a DAO, is that hopefully eventually, it kind of runs itself. And the system can be run by any individual. It's not really tied to my personal egoistical sense of success, or anyone else in the core team's individual sense of success, but rather it has its own purpose, and it's able to function, as an organic entity providing preventive healthcare, preventive wellness services. If that can happen, and if it can outlast, any personal ambition that me or the other core team members have, I think that would be incredible, and I'd be really happy with that.
Yes, yes, and I think that most founders and core teams that have that ethos are going to give rise to beautiful and very successful projects. And so at this point, I am going to open up the floor to anybody who has comments or questions. Please feel free to just request to come up to speak. In the meantime, as people become unshy and think about their questions, one question that I had to you, Shan, is that the World Economic Forum currently defines four types of health services, right? Single payer universal coverage, multi-payer universal coverage, multi-payer non-universal coverage, and then no national health care. Where do you envision HEA and the HEA perspective of healthcare within those frameworks?
That's an interesting question. We are actually exploring a few of those models. But in a broad sense, I don't think HEA seeks to sort of replace what we have right now or any sort of traditional healthcare system. HEA is a preventive wellness system, so it's really a parallel to how healthcare is already being done because we have different forms of healthcare services that we get. We have like accident coverage. We have stuff that preventive wellness literally is unable to resolve, non-lifestyle related diseases. So preventive wellness of HA generally is a network that acts in complement with the traditional healthcare system. But then the question, of course, that the World Economic Forum is pretty much asking is the funding, or rather, like, what is the sustainability, financial sustainability, and where's the financial funding for HEA's network going to come from? Uh, this is a complex problem. I don't actually have an answer for this yet, but we are exploring like a few different mechanisms by which it could work. One way it could be some sort of partnership with existing insurance entities, either as sort of a way to reduce to reduce the insurance payments that you might have. But again, I think we're trying not to jump too quickly into a solution here with regards to that specific problem. Because I think in the Web3 space, there are lots of business models that are not well explored enough yet. Just because it's such a nascent space. And we want to kind of stick around without committing to a specific financial model to see if there is any way in which the newer forms of Web3 funding and the newer forms of Web3 business models that are coming around could be applied to the way preventive health is funded. But yeah, this is an ongoing conversation. I don't think it fits neatly in any of the categories that you mentioned. But it'll probably, and another thing here is that it's also very dependent on the country that the network is operating in. So in a country, say with universal healthcare, the UK has the NHS, a lot of European countries have universal healthcare. It might need a different method of operation than in the US or in Singapore. So yeah, it's a complicated question. I don't have a clear answer for you, but I don't think it's any specific one yet.
No, I love what you said, and I don't think anybody really has the question for this because sorry, the answer for this because it is it's counterintuitively a new concept that is being applied. And I am just like you. I'm looking to see. I appreciate your perspective of taking it slow, not necessarily jumping into a particularly defined model because the Web3 space is new and there is a lot of atypical, business models that may come out or funding models that may come out of it. So it's better to kind of wait and see. Personally, I see preventive healthcare as the precursor to everything, where everything is, but it's like the massive universal precursor. It's the steady state, it's the standard which everything operates off of, and then all um, these four healthcare services are kind of the after effect, where when that fails to happen. But preventive healthcare should just be a norm, in my opinion, um, as like a steady, almost like the concept of like a universal basic income. There should just be a universal preventative care services that are just everywhere within the ecosystem.
Yeah, no,
Um,
I respect and completely agree with that vision because, well, the thing is, preventive healthcare is actually really cheap. It has a very low cost associated to it because all you're really doing is helping people eat right and walk around and sleep well, and a lot of preventive healthcare is self-redundant. So once you actually help one person, once you give them the tools, they are able to go on and apply that without recurring cost as opposed to traditional, reactive healthcare, which there is an ongoing cost and it generally requires more funding. Preventive healthcare is relatively light on funding. Um,
exactly.
so yeah, no, that would be the dream.
Yeah, and as I mean, as you said, right, as you educate individuals to learn how to do so, they relay that to their next generation, to their counterparts, their loved ones. And so there's almost a ripple effect. So it reduces costs exponentially as more and more people become educated and can relay this information forward. Yeah, no, I think that much like how there was resistance when the COVID pandemic hit, and the world shifted towards virtual and remote working conditions, and like the kind of the worry about how would that impact, sorry, efficiency, work efficiency, and the like. But we've noticed, and I think everybody has come to realize that it has largely increased people's capacity to work because they now have more time for themselves. They're more in locations, and there are limitations to this, and there are some drawbacks to this. But I think overall, considering and being more mindful of people's quality of life has generally shown, at least through the pandemic, that it's improved people's output of work. And I think this would be the same thing. If we start to emphasize this preventative healthcare, I think the world would be surprised at how much better we are off and how much money and time we save um, in the long run. But I don't want to take up too much time asking these questions because it's not just about my perspective. Ed, you're up here always with insightful questions. Please feel free to comment.
Yes, this is a great discussion around DeSci and wellness and health. I come from the what we sort of consider the roots of health in agriculture and working with regenerative agriculture. And for many decades, we've been looking at, what does food and how we produce it have to do with health? And with the industrialization of agriculture, we started seeing produce, whatever it might be that we grew, going out the door to somebody that's going to eat it and really wondering, like, what's going to happen after this with their health. We started to get really worried about it because we saw nutrient loss and nutrient density and spectrum loss. And we saw, pesticides, maybe they're safe, maybe they're not. Of course, I lived through the DDT era and when skull and crossbones was on everything that they told us to use. And so we sort of look at it like we can't really, if we don't fix where food starts. I mean, that's why we've realized soil health is important because that's the only way you're going to get a healthy plant. And a healthy plant is going to have full nutrition to it. An unhealthy plant isn't. And so, and if we eat stuff that isn't nutritious, isn't healthy, then how are we going to become healthy? And it's great that we can have these kind of discussions and form these kind of groups that can, talk between somebody that's trying to work on health at the roots of soil and somebody who's doing research on diseases that maybe are a result of the way we've been doing things, because it's either the environment or our food that have, other than our genetics, that have the most effect on everything. And agriculture has a lot to do with the very start of both of those and to solve all the problems all the way up the line. So thank you for this great discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ed. I think it constantly amazes me and makes me really appreciative of the community we have in sort of the Web3 space, is especially when we talk about things like this. Uh, I I really I think in the Web3 space we talk a lot about how everything is connected and in one complex dynamic system. And how agriculture affects well-being and how all these different factors from environmental health to planetary health to individual health to community health are all connected in really complicated ways. Um, that the fact that we're addressing that and we're talking about it is one of the things I like the most about the Web3 scene and the DeSci scene. I Yeah, I really appreciate your comment, and um, I'm quite interested to talk more, in fact, about your knowledge in agriculture and how that would affect human health. I think that could be a very interesting topic for HEA to explore in its blog.
Well, I would highly recommend it. Ed is a is a walking encyclopedia of gems. A lot of insight from the regenerative agriculture movement. So I highly encourage you guys to get in contact, as well as anybody else to get in contact with any of the members who have spoken up here. And Ed, to that exact point, I think it's a really beautiful point that you bring up because essentially, I can envision a positive feedback loop where, HEA's perspective of preventative healthcare, making people understand that there's a better way of living, will directly impact how they consume food, how they prepare food, how the infrastructure looks at food and agriculture and growing, and that again relays into things like pesticides and the biochemical systems and how we deal with the land, and that impacts ecosystems. And it's just a forward beneficial positive loop that starts just from this very small idea of just how can we live better, how can we kind of take care of ourselves a bit more, and it impacts the entirety of the planet that we live on. I think that's a very beautiful point, something that is very understated when we talk about these things, and I'd love to kind of emphasize that more. So we will have future conversations. You know, DeSci World is all about having these topic discussions and these different open topic initiatives. So both of you are very, very welcome to come on whenever we start these initiatives, or we push forward initiatives that touch upon these topics. And so if there are, you know, anybody else has a question, please again feel free to come up on stage and ask Shan. Otherwise, if not, Shan, do you have any parting words for our listeners?
Yeah. So we are always looking for new healers. We are always looking for new collaborators. And if anything I said today resonated with you, or you want to find out more, please visit our website at hea.care and come have a conversation. We're a pretty small community at the healer level. We only have about 25 people in the core healer community. So very tight, very passionate community. And we would love to hear more about your ideas, your problems, your concerns, your criticisms. Yeah, bring all of it. And I really hope to see you guys around. And thank you so much for DeSci World for setting this up.
Oh, it was an absolute pleasure. You've definitely resonated a lot with me. And you say 25 is small, but that's quite large from an organization perspective. Yeah, at least in the DeSci space. That's very good, and that's very promising for the future. And so with that, guys, we're gonna wrap up episode 18 apparently of DeSci Rising. As always, make sure your DMs are open. We will be dropping POAPs for our listeners. Also remember that you can watch this episode and any of the previous episodes of DeSci Rising on our DeSci World YouTube channel. I highly encourage to get in to learn more about the awesome projects that are developing within the space. As always, if you'd like to support our initiatives in any way, in anything else that we're doing, you can feel free to get one of our microbes NFTs. It helps us a lot. It also adds you as an early adopter to the DeSci World ecosystem, and their utility and purpose is going to be built and baked into everything that we ship moving forward. And then lastly, but not leastly, I would like to wish everybody a wonderful holiday season. I hope you take time to make sure that your healthcare, your mental health care is being taken care of. You take time for yourself, rejuvenate your mind, rejuvenate your body, absolutely rejuvenate your soul. And I look forward to seeing, sorry, excuse me. I look forward to hearing and seeing all of you in our next episode, which will be next Friday. And so after the Christmas holiday, but just before New Year's. So with that, everybody have a great weekend. Merry Christmas, happy holidays, and I will see you then.
Merry Christmas. Thank you.